In this video, we are going to talk about housing and living in England because this topic is important when looking to the social and economic differences found among the English population. In the previous videos, we have learned about the stereotypical three-class system, which no longer seems accurate these days. Since the BBC published the results of the Great British Class Survey, a new seven-class system was proposed in 2013, as explained in other episodes of this documentary. According to the major findings presented on the BBC website, the main aim of the survey was to focus on the social, cultural and economic capital of the British population. Economic capital, which can be linked to housing, includes income, savings, and the value of one's home, as pointed out on the website. The results of the survey showed that the classes newly labeled as elite, established middle class, and technical middle class include people with a high economic capital, whereas the new affluent workers only have a medium level of economic capital, and the other three classes only represent people with a low economic capital. This is important to keep in mind regarding the overall question of our videos. Is it really all about the money?
Furthermore, we have already received information on wealth and consumer behavior, which will now be connected to housing and living conditions in England. What does the dream home of a typical English person look like? Why are so many people not able to fulfill their dream of owning such a house? How will this develop in the future? To what extent do regional and social factors influence the housing market? We would like to discuss all these questions in order to give you an overview of the relationship between housing, social class and economic developments. Therefore, we will take a closer look at articles, books, pictures and statistics which outline the current developments and trends in England. First of all, we should start with the definition of the term housing. According to Chris Hemnett, who is the leading expert on housing wealth and inheritance, housing in general refers to the social issues of guaranteeing that members of society have a home, whether this is a house or some other kind of permanent accommodation, such as flats, farms or lodges. Before we talk about the current situation, let us have a brief look at the historical background of housing in England. Hemnett states that during the Second World War, many houses were destroyed and made uninhabitable, which led to a significant housing shortage. That was the reason why people had the opportunity to experiment with non-traditional methods of mass house building.
Hence, the number of home ownerships grew since World War II, from 31% in 1951 to 67% in 1991, which is why Hemnett states that housing has become a source as well as a store of wealth, and pointed out that having your own home was and is still seen as one of the most profitable investments after World War II. This is why housing seems to be an indicator and a determiner of social standing. This notion is still anchored in the English people's minds, which has led to the fact that they tend to dislike renting homes. Wherever they are, they like to put down roots, as stated in James O'Driscoll's student book about English culture. Although almost everyone in England wants to own a house, it is only in the last 4 to 5 decades that the majority of people have done so. Before, most people on lower incomes lived in rented accommodation. As O'Driscoll mentions in his book, in the 1960s and later, it was a marker of class whether you owned or rented. Unfortunately, not everyone is able to buy a home because of the social gap which comes with different incomes and savings.
According to Hemnett, professionals and managers are much more likely to own homes than the lower skilled and lower paid. This is probably still the case today, but not only savings and income determine people's possibilities. Also, the regions in England influence the affordability of accommodation. Hemnett confirms that especially in bigger cities, such as London, prices are much higher. Later on, we will present some data to clarify the regional imbalance in prices and income. But first, let us have a look at differences in living situations. There are certain types of accommodation in England, though some are more desirable than others. Most English people dream of living in a detached house. The famous saying, "An Englishman's home is his castle," which was also mentioned by O'Driscoll, illustrates the desire for privacy and the importance of ownership. That is why the most desirable home in England is a detached single-family house with a nice garden in a decent neighborhood, though many people have to realize that they lack the financial means to afford their dream house, as the architects Walter Stamm-Teske and Lars Christian Uhlig state. According to housing expert John Auckland, higher prices and prestige are associated with detached properties. Stamm-Teske and Uhlig confirm that semi-detached houses, which include two households in one building, and terraced houses, where several houses are joined in a row, are a cheaper alternative, though they don't provide as much privacy as a single-family house. According to O'Driscoll, rich people, often aristocratic families, who inherited their house from their ancestors, live in stately homes with a great area of land attached. The author also mentions that people who can afford it, as for instance the elite, buy a second house, usually in the country, where they can spend their weekends and their holidays.
But we also need to consider people who are not able to rent or buy a house. Especially young people, for instance students, often have to stay living with their parents or move into a flat. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government defined the term flat as follows. A flat is a separate and self-contained premises constructed or adapted for use for residential purposes and forming part of a building from some other part of which it is divided horizontally. This quote shows that flats and blocks of flats lack privacy, which is why English people prefer not to live in flats if they have the choice. Thus, it seems obvious that people from higher social ranks live on bigger properties, which offer a lot of space and privacy. On the other hand, people with lower financial opportunities, like the precariat, the emergent service workers, or the traditional working class, can't afford such amenities. As we move on to our next key factor, we would like to point out what the term affordability means in this context. According to both academics Glenn Bramley and Noah Kofi Carley, the term can be simply defined as a decent home for every family at a price within their means. In addition, they indicate that the term affordability is also connected to spatial availability and governmental support, which emphasizes that also regional and institutional factors play a role when it comes to living conditions. That leads us to the next point, owning and renting. Housing in England is divided into the public sector and the private sector. According to Auckland, the private sector includes owning and private renting. He points out that private renting means renting from a private landlord or private letting agency, whereas social renting belongs to the public sector. Auckland explains that social housing is provided by local authorities or housing associations for the people on low incomes and who are struggling with their housing costs. At the beginning of the 20th century, 23% of the people in England owned the homes they lived in and the rest rented, whereas a century later there were only 35% who rented, as housing expert Phineas Harper states. Although people in England are not fond of renting, it is the cheapest way to secure accommodation.
Especially in and near London, renting is cheaper per month than buying on a mortgage, which is why the number of ownerships is decreasing. According to David Matthews, home ownership is a more distant prospect for people without lots of money today, particularly for young adults. So age seems to be a factor too. The gap between wages and house prices in England has steadily widened in the last years. Matthews points out that in 1996, the average property cost little more than twice the average annual salary. By mid-2016, it cost 5 times the average. The number of people who own their own home or have a mortgage has been fallen since 2005 and was 65% in 2014, the lowest in almost 20 years, as the reporter Jonathan Owen states. And the journalist Julia Kolev predicts in her article that the number of households that rent privately will increase over the next few years, whereas the number of ownerships will further decrease. This graph also shows the trend away from social renting and owner occupation towards private renting, which was also confirmed by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government in their English Housing Survey in 2016 and 2017. According to the essay about the changing geography of privately rented housing by Donald Houston and Paul Sissons, one major reason why there is a trend towards private renting is that investments in the private renting sector have become more appealing because of the removal of rent controls, reduced security of tenure, and rising house prices. Houston and Sissons also said that changes to population and household structure, as well as earnings and employment in different parts of the country, will also influence the rate and nature of the private renting sector, because young people, single people, the economically inactive, and those on low incomes are more likely to rent. In other words, people from the precariat, the emergent service workers, and the traditional working class are much more likely to rent.
Houston's and Sissons' quote above leads us to the next point: regional differences in house prices. Where are people able to rent or buy? Since BBC published the house price calculator in April 2018, which was produced by Dominic Bailey, Prina Shaw, James Dooley, and Stephen Connell, citizens of the United Kingdom have the opportunity to choose their individual preferences, for example, how many bedrooms their property should have, and to find out where their wishes might be fulfilled. Further on, the website gives users the option to narrow down or raise their deposit, as well as their possible monthly payment for the accommodation. According to the calculator, the national average deposit is £25,896, and the national average monthly payment is £583. The calculator shows us that the closer you get to London, the higher the prices are, and the most expensive area to live in is Kensington and Chelsea, a borough in West London. If you are interested in finding out where you can afford to live in the UK, check the BBC's website and try out the calculator yourself. The fact that the areas around England's capital are more expensive is also pointed out by the Office of National Statistics. Their data clearly shows that the average house price has risen from the year 2007 to 2017 even more than 60%.
Next, we want to have a look at what to do if you don't have the financial means to buy a house on your own. The video "Why You Can't Afford a Home in the UK", provided by the New Economic Foundation, shows that because of rising house prices in low incomes, many people are not able to finance their home only with savings. It is also explained that if the English want to buy a home, they need to borrow money in form of mortgages, which can be advantageous for banks because if people are not able to repay their debts, the banks can take their property back to sell it. The video also shows that many English people need to borrow money because their house prices increase, which leads to the problem that the rising prices are often above people's incomes. This seems to be a vicious circle which needs to be interrupted in order to improve the current housing situation.
But not everyone is able to obtain permanent accommodation. There are also people who can be seen as the level below the precariat. The Department for Communities and Local Government describes somebody as homeless if they have no accommodation or it is not reasonable for them to continue to occupy the accommodation they have. As the department pointed out, even in England the number of rough sleepers increased from 1,800 in 2010 to 4,000 in 2016, and the number of people in temporary homes increased from 49,000 in 2011 to 77,000 in 2017. They also mention that especially in London, the number of homeless people has risen drastically, which is also the reason why the Homelessness Reduction Act was introduced in 2017 with the aim to give local authorities more opportunities to prevent homelessness. All in all, it seems that the declining affordability of properties is one major factor that has caused the rising numbers of homeless people.
According to the different data we have looked at, we tried to figure out the main factors that have an impact on housing in England. First of all, we learned that wealth and income are the two most important factors that influence people's living conditions. In addition, personal savings and heritage also have an effect on financial position and property ownership. Besides that, regional differences and varying prices play a significant role when it comes to finding a home that suits people's preferences and pockets. We found out that the dream of English people is typically to buy a family house, and though this wish is anchored in the English people's minds, more and more people have to rent a home because they are not able to buy one. The rising number of households that rent accommodation goes back to increasing house prices. Especially, areas around London are very expensive. So, is it all about the money? Apparently it is. Of course, regional factors do also play a role, but eventually, money determines if someone is able to buy a house or has to rent a flat. That is why wealth, and therefore housing, seem to be huge sources of inequality. It is also interesting to look at data that we received from our fellow students who are also part of this documentary project. In their interviews, some English people were asked in how far they think that housing and social class are related, whether a house might indicate one's social class, and what the neighborhood you live in tells us about it.
All of the interviewees are of the opinion that housing itself, as well as the people who live around you, have a huge impact on your social class. One woman pointed out that people with fewer financial opportunities live in affordable housing or council housing, whereas she owns a semi-detached house on a nice estate, which gives her the impression that she belongs to a higher social rank. In addition, another interviewee said that your house represents your wealth as such. This clearly indicates that money is an important aspect when we are looking at the current housing situation in England.